it will fix the material, and fixing it means it's a negative process. So it's a negative photoresist. And having patterns in here, for instance, things that look like this are patterned into there, and then we can actually pattern those and etch away using the pattern in the HSQ to replicate that into the silicon. So these are, although we're showing them in many colours as a regular array of cylinders, those are actually all of the silicon from which we originally start. So we've etched into the silicon. The silicon is, of course, hundreds of micrometers thick, and we are patterning pillars which are perhaps a micrometer or so high, depending on the circumstances. They may only be 200 or 300 nanometers high, and the diameter of those cylinders may be a few hundred nanometers. So, so that's now the a scanning electron microscope image of an array of cylinders formed in silicon. You see quite high regularity, quite smooth sidewalls. This is certainly very adequate for the application of nanometer photography, which I'm now talking, which is the fabrication of light emitting diodes. So that's one publication, as I say, this recent publication in 5 articles. Next one. Right, so this is a machine for carrying out nanoimprint lithography by the so-called heat and pressure method, which does not rely on the stamp being transparent, which it would require to be if we were using ultraviolet light illumination. So I talked about one particular process where we actually have, we take it to temperatures like 120 degrees centigrade, and we elevate the pressure. The stamp itself must be evenly pressed, of course, if we're going to accept 40 atmospheres pressure. It's a commercial machine made in Sweden, and these are being sold or have been sold into the industry that makes light emitting diodes. One press. So there's a process, one version of the process. You'll see other images in due course. Here's our stamp. I'm going to make a word for mold. I'm choosing to spell it M-O-U-L-D, which is the English spelling, which is the American spelling of the word mold, and it still means a stamp or a mark. And we press it into a layer, in this case of a specifically chosen polymer. We squeeze that polymer down, and we can pattern, we can transfer fairly accurately the pattern that we've etched already into our mold, into its image in polymer. So it's an image of this has to be an image of the eventual structure we want. We can play around with the temperature in such a way, curing, and the vital stage of nanoimprint lithography is to be able to remove the mold, leaving patterned polymer replicating the original, and then we need perhaps to remove surplus residual material carefully in order to have something which is now a pattern polymer which will define where we're going to then etch into something else. And this is one particular resist that's a commercial resist. We're working on the semiconductor gallium nitride, because gallium nitride or related materials to gallium nitride have epitaxial structures with heterostructures, for instance, of indium gallium nitride and aluminium gallium nitride, like Taiwan. They will actually quite happily sell you large amounts of this at moderately, at reasonable prices. So if you want to buy the stuff, it's available. And they will be surprised on occasions that you complain about this quality of the surface that has been produced. They say, oh, well, we thought you wanted a rough surface. For some purposes, that might be a good thing. And the main point I'm making, therefore, about roughness is that this process I've described still works on a rough surface. It doesn't have to be a perfectly smooth surface. So we can accept a certain amount of imperfection and still have a useful device structure. Next one, please. Right, now I'm going to switch to talking about a version of photonic crystal structures, and I'm very careful to use the word a version, in other words, a version of applied to a sensing application, and this is a sensing application which is potentially very important in biomedicine. So we're talking about biosensors, and we're talking about a medical application, point-of-care diagnostics. So this is an area which is still very much a developing area of medicine. It is an area which potentially has very large amounts of value, as I will say a bit more in a second. We are talking about a project, a European project, P3Sense, polymer photonic multiparametric biochemical sensor for point-of-care diagnostics, with an S on the end which is missing. And it is the work of a group of people who have come together to formulate a consortium to carry out a project funded by the European community. Next one, please. So, the area that this is being targeted at is stroke. Stroke is something which, sooner or later, a large fraction of the people sitting in this room, and even myself standing up and those standing up, a large fraction of us is going to have this event happen to us, like it or not. You might say, in many cases, if we're lucky, we shall live long enough to get to a stroke, but a stroke is going to be what at least has a big impact on our lives, possibly, of course, kills us. So this is quite important medically. And I've learned in my little bit of activity in this that there are two types of stroke, so-called ischemic stroke and hemorrhagic stroke. I'm providing you with both the British English spelling of the word ischemic and hemorrhagic, where we put an A in there, and also the American spelling where they don't bother with the A. So just useful if you're Googling for the word to know that it has two versions. And 80% of the strokes which affect human beings, which are affecting the brain of a human being, are about blockage of the circulation in the brain of the blood. And in a way, perhaps that says, if we were allowed to get our medical people's ethics allowed them to, the obvious thing to do if somebody has a stroke, and you know they've had a stroke, and you want to get treatment to them soon enough to have a big impact on their recovery. If you want to have an impact on the stroke, the obvious thing to do would be to assume it's an ischemic stroke, and by assuming it's an ischemic stroke, you then bring in very drastic treatment to deal with a blockage of the circulation, and in 80% of the cases you would have done the right thing. Tough on the other 20% of people for whom this should not have been done, those are the people that had this other kind of stroke, because the treatment you've taken, now putting this rather crudely, the treatment you've applied has finished them off decisively. Ethically, that's, alas, not what you're allowed to do. You might say that in some respects it was a good way to go. So actually, the ethics say we must try and distinguish between these two, but we must try and do so rapidly. A 1 hour time scale between the event happening and starting the treatment is already a vital time scale. You don't have a day. The day is already too late. You want to do it preferably within an hour. Know what it is. You can't rely on this single technique that I'm talking about, no less. It can contribute, it can help you reinforce and know quickly what is going wrong, and therefore what treatment is involved. And we're talking about event which is happening to 1.1 million people per year within the European Union. An event which therefore has cost implications in terms of treatment. Just looking after somebody who's had a stroke, we're talking about 21 million euros, which even with the problems the euro is quite a lot of money. Next one. So there's the lady who's trying to sort out what's wrong with you, and you take some plasma, likely blood, from the body, and you carry out the process. It's a very popular, it's a very standard process in a sense that you're trying to do it in a controlled environment. I think you may find that your body is carrying out processes, involuntary processes. These are, of course, automated processes in the body which are to do with your survival of antibody-antigen reactions are happening in your body all the time. You are continually being exposed to things which your body's, your human body's action is to generate or use existing antibodies, and those antibodies are dealing with the antigens which are coming into your system just by breathing air in and out, or however. And one wants to be able to take a small amount of fluid from the body which may have this thing wrong with it. We may have an antigen which we want to tie onto an antibody which has been immobilized on a surface. This is a specific antibody. That's the key point. We have to have specific antibodies which relate to the medical event we're interested in. We want to extract fluid which has these antigens in. We want to tie it onto the antibodies in our sampling head. We want to go into our machine which reads what's happened, and within 10 to 15 minutes we want to be able to say, oh, I can detect specific, different, and several different types of antigen present in your body fluid. And liability to stroke, or the occurrence of stroke, has characteristic several different antigens, a whole panel of different antigens, and one needs a process which can look at a number of different antigens, look for them, the antigens, detect them, and indicate their presence. Next one. So this is one version of a device structure for carrying out this process of molecular biosensing for point-of-care diagnosis. We can imagine light coming in here, being distributed into a number of parallel channels, going into regions here of 2D photonic crystal. So these are holes etched perhaps into a silicon membrane. Word that Diana had some problems with translating now comes in membrane. It's a membrane, thin sheet of silicon perhaps, into which we drilled small holes to make a photonic crystal structure. Light can be channeled down this waveguide between regions of 2D crystal, and it can possibly couple across into these regions which form microcavities called high quality factor resonance structures, and immobilized locally onto those resonators we may have antibodies specific to particular antigens. So here I've got a cavity which is sensitive to the presence of this diamond-shaped orangey red antigen. Other ones are not detected. When these are immobilized, when these antigens are immobilized by adding them onto the antibodies which I have already fixed on the surface of the device structure, I've changed the local refractive index. Changing the refractive index changes the resonance frequency of this object here, which is a microcavity for light. We can have quality factors in these structures as high as 1 million, or in fact indeed several million if we choose. We may have to work with much smaller ones like a few thousand, but we still have a very frequency selective device which, when we change the boundary conditions by fixing biological material onto it, we change the refractive index. So we rely on a specific interaction. This is specific binding that is involved. And we have a panel of different resonators with different antibodies, In this way, by coupling into these separately and then detecting the change